thought the worst thing my husband ever did was stop loving me, but I was wrong. Because years later, in a hospital hallway, a stranger looked at me and asked, "Are you his mother?" And for the first time in my life, I didn't know the answer. The worst thing I thought my husband ever did was stop loving me. Then I stood in a hospital hallway under cold white lights, staring at a bleeding young man on a gurney, and a nurse asked me very softly, "Ma'am, are you his mother?" And for one horrible second, I realized I didn't know the answer. My name is Nora. I'm 57 years old. And before all of this happened, I used to think my life had already become the kind of story that was finished long before the ending arrived. Not tragic, not beautiful, just finished. The kind of life people call stable when they don't know what else to call it. The kind of marriage that looks respectable from the outside because nothing dramatic is happening. No screaming, no public scenes, no broken dishes, no police, no neighbors whispering. Just two people living side by side so quietly that eventually even the silence starts to feel like furniture. That was my marriage to Daniel. If you had met us at a wedding 10 years ago, you would have said we seemed dignified, grounded, well-matched even. He would stand straight with one hand loosely folded over the other. I would adjust my scarf or smooth the front of my dress. We would smile at the bride and groom. We would ask polite questions. We would eat carefully from our plates and leave at a reasonable hour. We knew how to be seen. That was one thing we were always good at, being seen the right way, not being known. Daniel had been a serious man even when he was young. That was one of the first things my mother liked about him. He has weight, she told me after meeting him. I remember wanting to laugh at that word, weight, as if she were choosing a piece of furniture that wouldn't tip over in a storm. I was 23 then, too old, according to some relatives, still young enough to believe that steadiness could become tenderness if I gave it enough time. Daniel wasn't cruel. That matters. People hear stories like mine and they start arranging everyone into neat shapes. Victim, villain, lover, wife. But real people are never that clean. Daniel was never a monster. He was a man with careful habits and a guarded heart. He worked in finance for a shipping company. He ironed his shirts himself, even after we had enough money to pay someone to do it. He folded newspapers into perfect rectangles after reading them. He kept receipts in labeled envelopes. He disliked waste. He disliked disorder. He disliked raised voices. When we first married, I used to mistake his quietness for depth. I thought maybe there was a whole secret world inside him. I thought if I was patient enough, gentle enough, loving enough, he would open. He did, in his own way. Just not in the way I had imagined. He was responsible, dependable. He paid bills before they were due. He took my father to appointments when my brothers were busy. He remembered which medicine gave my mother headaches. He never forgot our daughter's school fees. He made sure the locks were checked at night. He brought fruit home on Thursdays because that was the day the vendor had the freshest oranges. These are not small things. I know that now. Maybe I knew it then, too. But there's a kind of starvation that doesn't leave marks on the body. You can live years inside it before you even name it. The first few years of our marriage were not unhappy. Or maybe I should say they were busy enough to hide what was missing. Busy years are forgiving. There's always something to do. We had a tiny apartment then. The kitchen window stuck in summer. The bedroom fan rattled. The bathroom tiles were cracked near the drain. I used to stand in the kitchen in the mornings with wet hair and a cup of tea, listening to traffic wake up outside and think, this is adulthood. This is what it feels like. Not glamorous. Not cinematic. Just warm bread. Morning light. Laundry. Someone else's shoes by the door. Then I got pregnant with our daughter, Leah. The first time I held her, I cried so suddenly and so hard the nurse laughed and told me, at least wait until we clean her. She had a full mouth and long fingers. Daniel looked frightened when he held her. Not cold. Not distant. Frightened. I remember that clearly because it was one of the few times I saw all his control slip. He kept looking at her face like he couldn't believe something so fragile had been placed in his hands. For a while, Leah gave our marriage shape. Children do that. They become the center of the room. Everything else arranges itself around them. School runs, fevers, homework, birthday cakes, missing socks, dentist appointments, science projects built at midnight, parent-teacher meetings where one of us listened and the other pretended not to worry. I became very good at the 1,000 invisible tasks that make a home run without applause. I packed lunches. I remembered vaccination dates. I knew when the gas bill was due and when the uniforms needed replacing. I could tell from the sound of Leah's footsteps if she had done badly on an exam. I could tell from the way Daniel set down his keys whether work had angered him. I don't know when exactly love became labor. Maybe it always does. Maybe the problem begins when only one person notices. Leah grew. That happened the way all difficult things happen. Slowly enough to miss. Suddenly enough to break your heart. One year, I was tying her hair before school. The next, she was closing her bedroom door and asking for privacy. Then she was teaching me how to use video calls. Then she was rolling her eyes when I asked too many questions. Then she was taller than me. I loved her in all her versions. The chubby-cheeked child who slept with one sock on and one sock off. The stubborn teenager who argued like her father and cried like me. The young woman with the suitcase in the hallway pretending not to be scared of leaving. When she got a scholarship abroad, everyone congratulated us. "We are so proud," I said. And I was. God, I was. But after the airport goodbye, I came home and stood in her room with my hand on the bedpost and felt something inside me collapse in complete silence. Her room still smelled faintly of her shampoo. There was a pen on the floor, a hair tie on the study desk, a sweater she had forgotten hanging behind the door. I sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the sunlight on the curtain for so long the room went dim around me. That was the beginning of the house changing. Or maybe the beginning of me finally hearing it. Without Leah in the middle, there was nothing to soften the distance between me and Daniel. Our conversations, once limited, became skeletal. "Did you call the plumber?" "Yes." "What time is your appointment?" 3. "Your sister phoned." "I'll call back." Sometimes entire evenings passed without either of us saying anything beyond necessity. He watched the news. I wiped already clean counters. He read financial pages. I folded towels that did not need folding. We moved through the same rooms with the practiced awareness of people who had stopped trying to reach each other, but still knew exactly where the other person was. He would clear his throat before speaking. I would straighten things when nervous. He slept on his side, back turned. I lay awake longer than I admitted. There were nights when I listened to him breathe and tried to remember what it had once felt like to be wanted. Not needed, not respected. Wanted. There is a difference. A brutal one. When I retired, the emptiness got louder. I had worked for years in school administration. Nothing glamorous. Attendance records. Parent communication. Exam scheduling. Budget headaches. Lost forms. Crying children. Angry fathers. Teachers who needed 20 things at once. I complained about that job for half my life. Then I left. And the days opened like blank paper I didn't know how to fill. People romanticize retirement. They talk about freedom, rest, leisure. They don't tell you how strange it feels to lose the structure that once held your identity together. At first, I tried to enjoy it. I made proper breakfasts. I reorganized cupboards. I started going on morning walks. I called relatives I had been too busy to call for years. I bought a set of ceramic bowls I didn't need. I learned to make a soup the way my grandmother used to. For a month or two, I told myself I was adjusting. Then one afternoon, I caught my reflection in the microwave door while waiting for tea to warm, and I had the sudden, ugly feeling that I was fading in plain sight. I wasn't old in the dramatic way. I could still walk for miles. My hair was more silver than black, but thick. My face had softened, yes, but it was still mine. It wasn't age, exactly. It was invisibility. The kind that arrives not because people are cruel, but because they stop expecting you to contain surprise. Women like me become background very easily. If we are useful, we are appreciated. If we are quiet, we are admired. If we ask for very little, everyone calls us strong. And one day you realize you have become a room other people pass through, not a person with weather of her own. I started volunteering at the community library because the woman at the front desk of the clinic where I got my blood pressure checked mentioned they needed help. "Just a few afternoons a week," she said. "You like books, don't you?" I almost said, "I like having somewhere to go." But I smiled and said yes. The library was small, older than it looked from the outside. The floors creaked in certain aisles. The reading room always smelled faintly of dust, paper, and boiled tea. There was a tiny courtyard at the back, with 2 iron chairs that got too hot in summer and too cold in winter. Children came in after school and ran fingers over the spines like they were touching treasure. Old men read newspapers for hours and never borrowed anything. Women came in asking for cookbooks and left with novels instead. I loved it immediately. Not because it was exciting, because it was gentle. There is comfort in places built for quiet. At first, the work was simple. Sorting returns, shelving donations, wiping tables, helping confused teenagers find books they pretended were for school, but were obviously for heartbreak. I wore comfortable shoes and tied my hair back, and felt useful in a way that didn't belong to anyone at home. That is where I met Ethan. He was younger than me. Not so young it was absurd. Young enough that I noticed the difference without fully understanding what it meant. He managed the afternoon programming and assisted with cataloging. He had quick hands and warm eyes, and the kind of easy energy that changes the temperature of a room without asking permission. The first time we really spoke, I was in the donations section restacking a cart because I had arranged the books by color. I know. It makes no sense. Even then, I knew it made no sense. But I had been alone in the back room for an hour, and the faded reds and blues and creams looked comforting beside each other. He came around the corner carrying a stack of children's encyclopedias. He stopped, looked at the shelf, then looked at me. "You always stack books by color," he said. I felt embarrassed immediately. "Only when nobody's looking." He smiled. "That's not efficient. I'm aware, but it's beautiful." He said it lightly, just a passing remark, but something in me went still. Beautiful. Not the books, not the shelf. Something I had done, something touched by my hands. I laughed it off. He moved on, and yet the word stayed with me all evening. At dinner, Daniel asked if there was more rice. I passed the bowl. He said nothing about how absent I seemed. Nothing about how I kept hearing another man's voice in my head over the sound of spoons on plates. The next week, Ethan asked if I wanted tea during our break. "Only if you're making it," I said. He grinned. "That is a dangerous level of trust." "It's tea," I said. He held up a finger. "A badly made cup can ruin a day." That was how it started. Not with hunger. Not with reckless heat. With conversation. Tea in paper cups. 5-minute breaks that became 15. Small jokes. Questions asked like he actually wanted the answers. He noticed things. That was his gift. And maybe his danger. He noticed when I switched from silver bangles to the old green glass ones I only wore when I was feeling restless. He noticed when I trimmed my hair. He noticed I favored poems over novels when I was sad. He noticed I never ate the biscuit served with tea and always wrapped it in tissue to bring home. "One day," he said, "you'll have to tell me why you saved those." I shrugged. Habit? That usually means the real answer is longer. He was like that, always stepping half an inch closer to the emotional truth, then stopping just before it became rude. It made me feel seen. And once you have been unseen for long enough, being seen can feel dangerously close to being loved. I told myself I was not foolish. I told myself I understood the difference between attention and devotion. I told myself I was a grown woman, not some dramatic girl in a borrowed romance. But the body can betray you before the mind catches up. I started carrying what I wore to the library, not in an obvious way, nothing flashy, just softer colors, a little perfume at my wrists, lip balm, earrings I hadn't touched in years. I began looking at myself before leaving the house, not because I thought I was beautiful, because I wanted to look like someone who might still be noticed. Ethan made it easy. Too easy. He asked about my childhood, about books I had loved when I was 15, about the first city I ever visited alone, about whether I had ever wanted a life different from the one I had. That one caught me off guard. We were in the courtyard. It was late afternoon. The evening sounds had just drifted in from the neighborhood down the road. There were dry leaves caught near the drain. He was stirring too much sugar into his tea. "Have you?" he asked. "Wanted a different life?" I looked at him and felt, for one uneasy second, as if he had opened a drawer I kept locked even for myself. "I don't know," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "That usually means yes, or that I'm old enough not to waste time on fantasy. Do you really think wanting is fantasy?" I should have changed the subject. I knew that even then. Instead I said, "Sometimes wanting is the cruelest part." He didn't answer. He only looked at me with this strange softness that made the air feel thinner. After that, I started measuring my days by whether I would see him. That embarrassed me. It also thrilled me. I hated both feelings. Daniel noticed changes before I did. Or maybe he noticed them before I admitted them. He was never a man who missed details. One night, while I was putting away leftovers, he said, "You're coming home late?" Not accusing, not curious, just stating a fact the way one might mention rain. "Library work," I said. He folded his newspaper once. "Every day?" "We've been reorganizing donations." He nodded. That was all. He went back to reading, but I felt my pulse in my throat for the next hour. His silence was never empty. That was the thing people didn't understand about Daniel. He could say very little and still make you feel completely exposed. Ethan and I began walking after closing. At first it was practical. The road toward the bus stop was dim in the evenings. He said he was heading the same way. Then he began taking the longer route. Then I began hoping he would. We talked about everything and nothing. The cracked pavement, his mother's bad knees, my daughter overseas, the absurd confidence of teenage boys, the books donors left us with their names written lovingly inside the covers, as if handing part of themselves away. He told me he had once wanted to study architecture, but life happened, he said with a shrug. I asked what that meant. He laughed. It means my father got sick, my brothers were useless, and dreams became expensive. There were moments when he sounded older than he looked, moments when I thought maybe he understood disappointment better than his easy smile suggested. Then there were moments that reminded me he still lived as if choices could be remade. One evening, a light rain started while we were walking. Not enough to run from, just enough to silver the road. We stood under the narrow awning of a closed tailor shop while traffic hissed past. I could smell wet dust. His sleeve brushed mine. Neither of us moved away. "You know," he said, looking out at the road, "you seem happiest when you forget to be careful." I gave a short laugh. "I'm always careful." "No." He turned to me. "You're practiced. That's different." I felt that somewhere deep and old, in a part of me that had spent decades being praised for restraint. "What exactly do you think you know about me?" I asked. He held my gaze. "Enough to know there's a version of you nobody gets to meet." I should have been offended. Maybe I was. But beneath that, there was hunger. Because what if he was right? What if there was still some undiscovered self inside me, waiting under years of duty and repetition and politeness, like a hand underwater? Our first touch was absurdly small. That is why it still lives in my memory so clearly. It was evening. The sky had turned that deep orange that only lasts a few minutes before giving way. We were walking through the park behind the municipal office. Children were shouting near the swings. A street vendor was roasting corn. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then stopped. I was telling him about the time Leah, at age 8, had cut her own hair and tried to blame the ceiling fan. He laughed so hard he bent forward. Without thinking, I touched his arm, just above the wrist. Barely anything. But then his hand turned. My fingers slid into his, and he held on. Neither of us spoke. I remember hearing the crunch of gravel under someone else's shoes nearby. I remember a scooter backfiring on the street. I remember the heat of his palm and the shock of how quickly my body recognized that sensation as danger and relief at the same time. I didn't pull away. That was the moment everything changed. Not because he kissed me. He didn't. Not then. Not because we made promises. We didn't. Because I let myself cross the smallest line. And once you do that, every lie afterward becomes easier to rehearse. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I deserved one corner of my life where I felt awake. I told myself no one was being hurt, because nothing truly unforgivable had happened yet. That is how people betray themselves. Not with one grand decision. With a series of whispers they mistake for reason. Ethan kissed me 3 weeks later. In the library storeroom, I can still see the shelves around us. Boxes labeled children's series, old magazines, archive, the buzzing fluorescent light above us. I was holding a stack of returned paperbacks. He stepped close to take them. Didn't. Just stood there. "Nora," he said quietly. That was all. Just my name. And I knew. I should have walked out. Instead, I stood very still and let him touch my face, as if I were something fragile and not a woman old enough to know better. The kiss itself was brief, soft. More devastating for that. When it ended, I felt the room tilt in the strangest way, like I had lost something and gained something at the exact same time. He whispered, "Tell me to stop." I didn't. We never had a proper affair in the dramatic sense people imagine. There were no hotels every week, no wild declarations, no plans to run away. That almost makes it sound innocent. It wasn't. It was intimate in a quieter, more dangerous way. Tea that lasted too long, messages that became personal, walks that strayed farther from coincidence, a hand at the small of my back guiding me through a doorway. A laugh shared a second longer than necessary. One afternoon in his car on a side street, listening to the rain hit the windshield, while he kissed me like he had all the time in the world. And me, closing my eyes as if that would somehow reduce the truth of it. At home, I became two people. The woman who stood at the sink washing soups while Daniel dried his hands on a towel, and the woman who replayed Ethan's voice in her head while folding bed sheets. The split exhausted me. Guilt is heavy. Desire is heavier than people admit. Together, they make a person unstable. Daniel kept noticing. A different perfume. A message tone after dinner. The way I checked the hallway mirror before leaving. He never asked the right question. Maybe because he already knew the answer. One night he said, "You've started smiling at your phone." I looked up too fast. It was Leah. He held my gaze for 1 second too long. Then he said, That sound followed me into sleep. Leah noticed things too, though from a distance. She called on Sundays. Video calls full of bad timing and frozen screens. "Mom, you look nice," she said once. I laughed. "Is that unusual?" "Not unusual, just..." She leaned closer to her camera. "Different?" I asked what she meant. She smiled strangely. "Nothing. You seem lighter." If only she knew. I wasn't lighter. I was burning energy trying not to collapse under the weight of what I had become. Ethan began to ask dangerous questions. Not about leaving Daniel. He was too clever for that. But questions that created space around the possibility. "Do you think people get one life?" he asked during a walk. What kind of question is that? The kind people avoid when the answer might force change. I sighed. You speak like a man who's read too much poetry. And you speak like someone afraid to admit she agrees. There it was again. That way he had of making me feel both admired and cornered. Sometimes I mistook it for depth. Looking back, I think he loved being the one who awakened something in me. That is not the same as loving me. But I couldn't see that then. Not clearly. Then came the cafe. The day everything ended. It was outside the city, on a road lined with low trees and repair shops and fields burned pale by sun. Ethan had suggested it because nobody from your neighborhood would ever come here. I should have heard the warning inside that sentence. Instead, I heard only the invitation. We sat at a table near the edge of the veranda. Metal chairs, plastic tablecloth, tea in cloudy glasses. The sky was turning orange. There was a radio somewhere behind the counter, playing an old song I hadn't heard in years. We were laughing, too easily, too loudly, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy exactly, but from relief at having escaped consequence for a little longer. He was telling me about a woman who donated 47 romance novels and insisted they were her deceased husband's. I had just said, men are blamed for many things. Reading those was not one of them. He reached for my hand across the table, and then I heard a voice. "Auntie?" My whole body went cold. Not because I knew the voice immediately, because something in it carried disbelief so sharp, it felt like a blade. I turned. Leah was standing 3 steps away. She had one hand wrapped around the strap of her handbag. Her face had gone pale in that particular way people do when shock arrives before emotion. And behind her stood Daniel. He was very still. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times. Not the dramatic parts. The small ones. The way a motorbike passed behind them and no one moved. The way the cafe owner stopped wiping glasses. The way Ethan's hand left mine too late. The way Leah's eyes dropped to that movement and then lifted back to my face. "Mama?" she said. Not loud. Worse. Small. I stood up so quickly, my chair scraped hard against the floor. "Leah?" I don't know what I meant to say after that. Nothing on earth would have sounded less pathetic than it was. She looked at Daniel. Not at me. At him. As if she needed him to explain the shape of the world back to her. He said nothing. Of course he said nothing. That silence was his oldest weapon. Or maybe his oldest wound. Ethan started to speak. "Nora, maybe..." Daniel looked at him then. Just once. And Ethan stopped. It was not a threatening look. Not dramatic. Just a long, level look, from a man who had suddenly been made ridiculous in public and was too proud to perform pain for strangers. I don't remember walking to the car. I remember my legs moving. I remember Leah opening the back door and getting in without looking at me. I remember Daniel taking the driver's seat. I remember sitting in the passenger seat beside him and feeling farther away from him than if we had been on different continents. The drive home was one of the longest experiences of my life. Not because of distance, because of silence. Leah cried once, very quietly, like she was ashamed of being heard. I turned halfway in my seat. "Leah," she said, "please don't." That was it. Just those 2 words. Please don't. I faced forward again and stared at the road while streetlights came on one by one. At home, no one went to the kitchen. No one asked if anyone had eaten. We entered the house like mourners returning from a burial. Leah stood near the sofa, with both hands pressed flat against her thighs. Daniel set his keys in the bowl by the door with careful precision. I wanted someone to shout. I wanted someone to break the shape of what was happening. But that is not the family we were. Leah spoke first. "How long?" I closed my eyes. My mouth felt dry. "Leah?" "How long?" she repeated. I could hear her heart break, fighting with anger and losing. I said the truth, because there was nothing left to protect. "A few months." She gave a short laugh that turned into something like a choke. "A few months," she said, as if that makes it smaller. "It doesn't," I whispered. Daniel finally spoke. "Go to your room," he told her. She turned to him in disbelief. "No? Go to your room. I'm not 16. His jaw tightened. "No," he said quietly, "you're not. Which is why you should not have to stand here for this." There was something broken in his voice then. Not loud, but human. Leah stared at him, then at me. Then she walked away. I heard her door shut upstairs. A soft sound. Final. Daniel and I were left in the living room with the clock ticking above the bookshelf and the sound of a neighbor's television leaking faintly through the wall. I said, "I'm sorry." The words were obscene in their smallness. He didn't react, didn't pace, didn't accuse, didn't ask who Ethan was. He sat in the armchair across from me, like a man preparing to discuss property. "We won't divorce," he said. I thought I had misheard him. "What?" "We won't divorce." I stared at him. He looked exhausted, more than angry, exhausted in the bones. "For appearances," he said. "For Leah, for the family, for the community. Choose whichever explanation helps you live with yourself." "And us?" I asked, though even as I said it, I knew how pathetic it sounded. His face changed then. Not much, but enough. The last softness left it. There is no us anymore. I don't know why that hurt as much as it did. Maybe because some selfish part of me had believed that under the shock, under the humiliation, under the damage, there was still some piece of him that might fight for me. Instead, he closed the door without touching it. Neatly. Completely. That night, he took a pillow and blanket to the spare room. He did not slam the door. He did not make a speech. He simply moved out of the life we had shared, as if he had already rehearsed how to survive there without me. The next morning, there was tea on the table. 1 cup for him, 1 cup for me. No conversation. That was how our second marriage began. The dead one. I ended things with Ethan the following afternoon. Not in person. I didn't have the courage for that. I sent one message. "We can't continue. It's over. Please do not contact me again." I stared at the screen for 10 full minutes before sending it. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and waited for some grand ache, some cinematic collapse. What came instead was shame. Dense and hot and exhausting. He replied 22 minutes later, "I'm sorry." That was all. No fight. No plea. No declaration. Just, "I'm sorry." I read it 3 times, then deleted the thread. I remember thinking, so that's what I meant to him. Not nothing, but not enough. Months passed, then years. Not fast, not slow, just heavily. Heavily is the only word that fits. The house split itself into territories. His room, my room, his bathroom shelf, my bathroom shelf, his laundry basket, my laundry basket. We kept the rhythms of marriage without its tenderness. Groceries were bought, bills were paid, the leaking tap was fixed, medicine was restocked. When relatives visited, we became astonishing actors, seamless, even practiced. I handed him tea in front of guests. He asked if I wanted more rice. We sat beside each other at weddings. We posed in family photos. Anyone looking at us would have seen maturity, dignity, endurance. What they would not have seen was how carefully we avoided touching. Not only intimacy, any touch. If our fingers brushed while passing a plate, he withdrew as if he had come too near a flame. The first time it happened, I nearly dropped the spoon. After that, I started placing things down on tables rather than handing them directly. You learn the shape of another person's rejection very quickly when you live with it every day. Leah stayed distant at first. Not cruel, never cruel, but changed. Calls became shorter. Visits home became strategic. She was polite with me in the way strangers are polite when they know anger would open something messier than they can afford. With Daniel, she was softer, though not entirely herself. I don't blame her. Infidelity does not happen between two people. It spills. Children inhale it even when they are grown. A year later, she got engaged to a kind man named Noah. Thoughtful, gentle, the sort of man who carried tea trays for the women without needing to be asked. I liked him immediately. That made it hurt more. Wedding planning should have been joyful. And sometimes it was. Leah trying on dresses. My sisters arguing over floral arrangements. Noah pretending not to care what the menu was, while secretly caring very much. But under everything was that fracture. During one fitting, Leah stood on a low platform while a seamstress pinned the hem of her dress. She looked at herself in the mirror and said, very casually, "At least I know what I won't tolerate." The room was quiet for a second. The seamstress kept pinning. My sister pretended not to hear. I stood there holding a packet of safety pins and felt the blood drain from my face. Leah met my eyes in the mirror. Not vicious, just honest. That almost broke me more. At the wedding, Daniel and I performed better than ever. He greeted guests. I smiled until my jaw ached. When it was time for family photographs, he stood beside me. Not close, not far. Exactly the correct distance for a respectable husband. The photographer said, "A little closer, please." Daniel shifted half an inch. I could smell starch on his suit. I could feel nothing else. Later that night, after Leah left with her husband and the music had faded and relatives had gone home with sweets wrapped in napkins, I went into her empty room again. Not because I expected comfort there, because grief loves repetition. Daniel was in the hallway when I came out. For a second, we just looked at each other. The house felt impossibly large. He said, "You should sleep." I almost laughed. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to me all day that wasn't for an audience. Instead, I said, "So should you." Then we went to our separate rooms. That became our life. Two people aging beside a disaster neither could undo. Leah moved abroad after marriage. Not immediately, but soon enough. She and Noah built a life in another country. Better opportunities. Better pay. The usual reasons. When she called, she seemed happy. That should have been enough for me. Sometimes it was. Sometimes I would end the call and stand in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and think, I have become a mother people love from a safe distance. Daniel grew older in small, visible ways. He began taking longer to stand after sitting. He wore reading glasses more often. A deep line settled permanently between his eyebrows. Sometimes I caught him looking at old photos when he thought I wasn't home. Not photos of me, photos of Leah. School functions, beach trips, her graduation. The kind of moments people frame because they want proof happiness once existed. Now and then, despite everything, his old instincts of care surfaced. If I had a cough, there would be lozenges left on the dining table. If my car tire seemed low, it would be inflated by morning. If I forgot my umbrella, he would place it near the front door without comment. He took care in practical ways, the way some men say I love you. But after what happened, practicality became almost cruel. It was like being tended by someone who had declared your emotional death, but still watered the plant out of habit. And yet, I cannot pretend I did not also wound him. That would be too easy. There were nights when I heard him moving in the room next door and thought, I did this to him. Not all of him. Not whatever distance had existed before. But this shape of his pain. This sharpened restraint. This refusal of softness. I did that. Then came the hospital visit that cracked the past open. It was supposed to be routine. That's what I told Leah on the phone. That age has come, I joked. Now every month someone wants blood. She laughed and told me not to be dramatic. I had been feeling a dull ache low in my abdomen for a while. Nothing severe, just enough to nag. My doctor ordered scans and blood work. Probably nothing, she said. Probably, I repeated. I almost canceled the follow-up. Mostly because I was tired. Partly because after 50, every medical appointment feels like opening an envelope you do not want to read. But I went. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old air conditioning. A child was crying somewhere down the hall. A television mounted in the corner played a cooking show no one watched. When the doctor called me in, she was frowning at the screen. Not alarmed. Focused. That's worse, in some ways. She asked the usual questions first. Pain level? Appetite? Sleep? Then she said, "Have you ever had abdominal surgery?" No. She looked at me over her glasses. Are you sure? Yes. She turned the monitor toward me. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Gray shadows. Shapes. The secret architecture of a body I had lived in for decades without really seeing. There is scarring here, she said, tracing a spot with her finger. Old scarring. Significant. My first response was irritation, not fear. I thought perhaps she had mixed up files. That's impossible, I said. It's unlikely to be a mistake. I have never had surgery. She hesitated, then chose her words carefully. It looks like you had some kind of abdominal intervention many years ago. Many years. The room changed temperature around me. I laughed once. A dry, strange sound. You're telling me someone opened my body and I forgot? She didn't smile. Trauma, sedation, complicated medical events. Memory is not always reliable. I sat very still, and something faint moved at the back of my mind. Not a memory, a disturbance, like something buried turning in its sleep. I went home in a state I can only describe as split. The drive back is a blur. Traffic lights, vendors, an old song on the radio I turned off halfway through because it felt unbearable. At home, Daniel was in the living room, reading as always. The afternoon light made dust visible in the air. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, at his glasses low on his nose, at the familiar angle of his shoulders, at the man who'd spent years saying almost nothing, and yet had somehow become the keeper of more of my life than I understood. Did I ever have surgery? I asked. He looked up and froze. Not dramatically, just for a fraction of a second, but after years of watching his face for weather, I saw it. The pause, the tightness, the flicker of something he had not meant to show. My whole body went cold. What did you do? I whispered. He removed his glasses carefully, set them on the side table. He looked older than I'd seen him in years, not because his face had changed, because something in it had stopped defending itself. You were pregnant, he said. For a second, I thought the room had become soundless. Then I realized I could hear the clock, a car outside, a crow somewhere on the wall. Everything had sound. I just couldn't place myself inside it anymore. What? His voice was low, measured, too measured. I found out the night you were hospitalized. Hospitalized. Another word that hit me like an object thrown from a distance. I don't remember being hospitalized. He closed his eyes briefly. You had taken too many sleeping pills. The disturbance in my mind shifted again. A flash. A ceiling fan spinning too slowly. The taste of metal in my mouth. Vomiting. Someone calling my name from very far away. I gripped the back of a chair. That doesn't make sense. You were unconscious when they examined you. No. I shook my head hard. No, I would remember. His face changed. Not into anger. Into something harder. You don't remember many things from that time. That sentence landed somewhere deep, because it was true in a way I had never examined. The months before my wedding had always felt blurred in memory. Busy, emotional, crowded with rituals and shopping and relatives and exhaustion. There had been one party. I remembered that in fragments. My cousin's engagement celebration. Too many people. Music too loud. Someone handing me a drink I shouldn't have accepted. Laughter. Heat. A balcony. Then almost nothing. Only the morning after. A pounding head. A soreness I didn't want to interpret. A shame I buried before it had language. I had told myself it was drunkenness. Confusion. Nothing worth ruining a future over. I was engaged. A wedding was weeks away. Life had momentum. And women are taught early how to step over their own uncertainty if naming it would cost too much. I looked at Daniel. My voice came out thin. Whose child? He looked away. That was enough. I think some part of me understood before the answer arrived. Not because I remembered clearly, because I remembered not remembering. And there are absences that speak. Tell me, I said. His jaw moved. Once, then stilled. It wasn't mine. I sank into the chair behind me because my knees gave way. For a while, neither of us spoke. I could hear my own breathing. Too loud, too shallow. I ended it, he said. The words were so quiet that for a second I thought I had imagined them. I looked up. What? I signed the papers. The room lurched. You what? The doctors said you were unstable. They said the pregnancy was early, but you signed. You were carrying another man's child. His voice cracked then, for the first time in years. Cracked. Not loud, but raw. You were unconscious, he said. They asked who was responsible for you. I was there. I signed. I stood up so fast the chair legs scraped the floor. You had no right. He stood too, and suddenly the years between us were gone. Not healed. Gone. Burned away by something older. No right, he said. There was fury in him now. Not theatrical fury. The kind forged by decades of silence. What right did you have? I stared at him. He took a step toward me. You think I don't know what it cost me to do that? You think this is about you? I shouted. The word echoed in the room. We were not a shouting couple. That is perhaps why it felt so violent. He flinched. Or maybe I imagined it. I woke up one morning with my body changed, I said, my voice shaking. And you are telling me you knew. All these years, you knew. I thought if you never knew, maybe we could survive. Survive? I laughed then. A sharp, broken laugh. We didn't survive, Daniel. He looked as if I had struck him. Do you think I don't know that? Then why? I said. Why didn't you tell me? He sat down heavily, ran a hand over his face, and when he spoke again, his anger was threaded with something worse. Weariness. Because I was a coward, he said. The honesty of it shocked me. He swallowed. Because I was humiliated. Because I was angry. Because I was about to marry a woman I thought had chosen someone else. Because the doctors were talking, and your mother was crying, and I was 20-something, and proud, and stupid. And I thought if I could cut that part out of our lives before it began, then maybe there would still be a life left to save. I stared at him. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. And because, he said, quieter now, I didn't want to know if it had happened to you, or if you had done it willingly. I was too weak to ask. So I chose the version that let me stay angry, that hit somewhere deeper than the confession itself, because beneath it was another truth. He had never asked me what happened that night. Not once. Not then. Not ever. He had judged, acted, buried, and built our marriage on top of it, like pouring concrete over a body. I don't even remember, I said. My voice had gone small. That frightened me. I know, he said. No, I whispered. You don't. The ache in my abdomen, the doctor's screen, the half-memory of that old party, the months of shame I had folded into silence without understanding why. It all rose at once. I remembered the dress I wore that night. Blue. I remembered a stranger's watch catching light. I remembered trying to laugh while my stomach turned. I remembered waking with my underwear twisted wrong and a bruise on my thigh, and deciding not to look too closely. I remembered telling myself decent girls do not lose control like this. I remembered swallowing confusion, because the alternative would have cracked open everything. And now, here was Daniel, telling me a whole life had begun in that darkness, and he had ended it, or thought he had. I sat down because standing was impossible. Did you hate me? I asked. The question came from somewhere I had not intended to go. He looked startled, then tired. I hated what I thought had happened, he said. That's not the same. Was it enough of a difference? He didn't answer. Maybe there was no answer. We sat in that ruined living room with the late light fading and the dust in the air turning gray. I thought about the marriage we had lived. All those years, all that coldness, all that restraint, built not only on my betrayal later with Ethan, but on an older wound we had never named. A child, a hidden surgery, a decision made over my unconscious body. A silence so complete, it bent the rest of our lives around it. Then his phone rang. The sound was so ordinary, I almost resented it. He looked at the screen. His face changed immediately. It's Leah, he answered. I watched him listen. No words from him at first. Then, we're coming. He stood up. "Noah has been in an accident," he said. For a second, I couldn't process the sentence. Is he critical? Everything after that moved too fast. Keys, shoes, my scarf grabbed from the hook near the door. The car starting. The city outside suddenly unbearable in its normalcy. Street vendors still arguing over prices. Children still walking home from school. A man balancing bread trays on a bicycle. How dare the world remain ordinary when your life has just split open twice in one day? Daniel drove too fast. Neither of us mentioned what we had just unearthed. There was no room. My hands shook in my lap the whole way. Leah's husband Noah had been on the highway when a truck jackknifed in the rain. Multiple vehicles, multiple injuries. Leah was already at the hospital. By the time we arrived, the emergency wing was chaos. Doors swinging, phones ringing, nurses calling for charts. The smell of blood under antiseptic. People hunched in plastic chairs with the stunned faces of those who have entered a version of life that has no instructions. Leah was near the nurse's station. Her hair was loose. Her mascara streaked. When she saw us, she came straight into Daniel's arms first. Then, after half a second of hesitation that stabbed me more than I expected, she turned and let me hold her too. "He's in surgery," she said into my shoulder. "They said head injury, internal bleeding. They won't tell me anything clearly." I stroked her hair. "It's all right," I lied. "It's all right." Nothing was all right. We sat. We stood. We waited. That is what hospitals do to people. They reduce life to waiting under fluorescent lights. At some point, a nurse came rushing down the hallway, pushing another gurney. A young man, bleeding heavily, unconscious. There was dried blood near his temple, and fresh blood soaking the sheet near his shoulder. His face was turned partly toward me, and something in me snagged. Not recognition, not exactly, more like a sensation, a pull. The nurse glanced toward the station and called out that they needed family contact confirmation and blood typing fast. Another nurse, younger, with tired eyes behind a loose mask, looked from the clipboard to the gurney and then to me. Maybe because I had stood up. Maybe because I was staring. Maybe because in that strange, brutal hospital light, some small echo in his face answered something in mine. "Ma'am," she said gently, "are you his mother?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I looked at the young man again. Strong jaw. A slight bend in the nose. Dark hair damp with sweat. He was too old to belong to any world in which I had known him. And yet the question hit at me like memory, before memory exists. "No," I said automatically. Then softer. I don't know him." The nurse frowned at her chart. "We've got a rare blood type match flagged from the emergency database," she said, half to herself. "Same type. Very unusual." Daniel had come to stand beside me. I could feel him before I saw him. His stillness changed, shifted. The same calculation, the same horror, moving between us without words. I said, "What's his name?" "We're trying to confirm. The records don't match the ID he had on him." The gurney moved on. Just like that. But I stood rooted to the floor long after it disappeared behind swinging doors. Leah touched my arm. "Mama?" I looked at her. Her face blurred for a second. "I'm fine," I said. I wasn't. Hours passed in fragments. A surgeon came to update Leah on Noah. He was alive. Still critical. There would be more waiting, more monitoring, more uncertainty. I was grateful. I was terrified. And under all of it, that question kept replaying. "Are you his mother?" At one point, another doctor came out, asking if anyone in the waiting area had O negative with a rare subtype variation. I stood. "So do I said. Daniel turned to look at me. The doctor asked a few questions. Took me for screening. Everything after that became a blur of forms and corridors and clipped explanations. The injured young man needed blood urgently. No confirmed family yet. My match was unusually close. Then someone asked about prior surgical history, and I heard myself laugh. A terrible sound. Because what was history anymore? A technician took more samples than seemed necessary. A genetic screening panel had already been triggered because of a discrepancy in his records from an earlier medical database. I did not fully understand half of what they were saying. I only understood the feeling, that the floor under my life was continuing to crack, and everyone around me was speaking in calm, professional voices while I fell through it. Daniel sat beside me afterward. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The waiting room lights made everyone look washed out. There was a vending machine humming in the corner. Somewhere down the hall, a woman was praying under her breath. Finally, he said, very quietly, "It can't be." I kept staring ahead. "What if it is?" He swallowed. "The procedure." "You told me what you signed," I said. "Yes. And I'm telling you," I turned to him then, "what if that isn't what happened?" I watched the idea enter him, watched him resist it, watched terror make room for itself. We were called into a consultation room near dawn. Those rooms are always too small for what happens inside them. There was a table, 3 chairs, a tissue box, a smell of stale coffee. The doctor closed the door. She had kind eyes. I hated her for that immediately, because kind eyes usually mean someone is about to rearrange your life with careful language. She sat down. "There appears to have been a historical records error," she said. No one reacted, so she continued. The young man had been adopted as an infant through a private chain of care following an administrative mix-up tied to an emergency obstetric case decades earlier. Incomplete maternal data, incorrect termination notation, transfer between facilities, misfiled documentation, human error, bureaucratic language for catastrophe. I stared at her. My hands had gone numb. Daniel said, "Say that plainly." She looked at both of us. Her voice softened. "The pregnancy appears not to have ended the way the record indicated. There were complications. The fetus survived emergency intervention. There was a transfer. And because of the condition of the mother and subsequent paperwork failures," she paused. "The child lived. No one moved. No one breathed. The child lived." The words floated in the room like something holy and monstrous at once. I heard myself ask, "Where has he been?" "With an adoptive family," she said. "His parents are deceased now. We're trying to reach the relative listed in his file." I stared at the table, at a scratch in the laminate, at my own fingers, older now, shaking slightly against the wood. "How old is he?" I asked, though I already knew. 33? 33. An entire human life. Birthdays, illnesses, school uniforms. First heartbreak. Jobs, private habits, favorite foods, the way he probably rubbed his forehead when tired. All of it had happened somewhere beyond the walls of my knowledge, while I lived under the false grave of his absence. Daniel leaned back slowly, as if he had been physically struck. His face had gone gray. I thought absurdly, he looks like a man who has met his own past in a hallway. I wanted to hate him in that moment. Perhaps I did. But I also saw him. Really saw him. A young man in a hospital decades ago. Proud. Humiliated. Frightened. Signing papers he barely understood because someone in a white coat made it sound final. Building a life afterward on an assumption that became the architecture of our ruin. And now, finding out the thing he buried had been breathing all along. That does not absolve him. Nothing absolves him. But pain is complicated when everyone has blood on their hands, even if not all of it was drawn intentionally. I started crying then. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just tears that would not stop. Leah was called in after. We had to tell her. How do you tell your daughter she has a brother no one knew existed? How do you say, while your husband lies in intensive care, that the family history you thought you inherited has a door in it and there is a man on the other side? She sat very still as I spoke. At first, she thought stress had made me incoherent. Then she looked at Daniel. Whatever she saw in his face made her believe me. She covered her mouth with both hands and cried without sound. I pulled her into me. This time she did not hesitate. "Mama," she whispered. "Only that?" And in that word was shock and grief, and some old child part of her that still knew how to reach for me when the world stopped making sense. We saw him later that afternoon. He was still unconscious, bandages at his shoulder, a bruise darkening along his jaw, machines breathing and measuring and insisting on the body's fragility. I stood at the foot of the bed first, unable to move closer. Because what does a mother look like in a room where motherhood has arrived 33 years late? He looked ordinary. That is what undid me. Not miraculous, not symbolic, ordinary in the most devastating way. A real man, a life, not an idea, not punishment, not redemption, a person. Leah stood beside me, Daniel behind us. I moved closer finally, His hand rested open on the blanket. Long fingers. My fingers. Or maybe that was imagination. Maybe after enough grief, people start reaching for resemblance anywhere they can. I whispered, "I'm here." It was ridiculous. He could not hear me. Or maybe he could. Hospitals are full of things science measures and grief refuses to quantify. Daniel did not come close to the bed at first. He stayed near the door, hands clasped so tightly I could see the strain in his wrists. Eventually, he stepped forward, looked down at the young man for a long time, then sat in the chair by the wall as if his legs had stopped functioning. He did not cry. Daniel almost never cried, but something in his face had opened beyond repair. We learned pieces over the next 2 days. The adoptive parents were kind people from another city. They had loved him. His name was Samuel. He had studied engineering. He worked in transport logistics. He liked old films. He played cricket badly, but insistently. He had a scar on his chin from falling out of a tree at age 10. He hated coriander. He had once wanted to learn the piano and never did. I listened to these details the way starving people eat, greedily, with guilt. His aunt arrived and filled in what she could. She knew very little about his origins, only that the adoption had always carried gaps, records that didn't align. Questions his parents had stopped asking because they were afraid the asking might somehow take him away. Samuel himself had apparently laughed about it. "Maybe I was delivered by aliens," he once joked. I sat with that. A man joked through the wound of not knowing? Well, I had spent decades grieving something I had not known enough to grieve correctly. Noah slowly stabilized. Leah moved between 2 rooms. Her husband, her brother. I watched her become someone new in real time. A daughter, a wife, a sister after 30 years of only child certainty. One evening, when the corridors were quieter and the windows reflected more darkness than light, she sat beside me with a cup of vending machine tea gone cold in her hands. "I used to think the worst thing you did was the affair," she said. The honesty of it did not surprise me. I nodded. "I know." She stared into the cup. "I still don't know how to forgive that." "You may never have to," I said. She looked at me then. Her eyes were tired in the way deep stress makes them tired. "But this," she exhaled shakily, "this is something else." I knew what she meant, because that was how I felt too. The affair had been a wound I chose, or helped choose. This was an underground river, a buried thing shaping the earth under every step, long before I knew its name. That night, after Leah went to check on Noah, I found Daniel sitting alone in the hallway outside Samuel's room. The lights were dimmed slightly. A cleaner's cart stood abandoned near the elevator. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine beeped in steady intervals. He didn't look up when I sat beside him. For a while, we just listened to the hospital breathing around us. Then he said, "Everything we buried found its way back." I turned to him. His voice was almost gone. "I thought silence was control," he said. "I thought if I refused to say a thing aloud, maybe it would shrink." I said nothing. He rubbed his palms together once, slowly. "When you were with that man," he said, "I thought that was the full measure of my humiliation. I thought that was the thing that had broken us. I used it to explain everything. But maybe," he stopped, "maybe we were already living inside something broken." There it was. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Truth. Late, ugly, incomplete. But truth. I looked at him, at the man I had married, at the man I had betrayed, at the man who had taken a choice from me, at the man who had sat beside my life for decades, while we both mistook silence for survival. "We were," I said. He nodded. And for the first time in years, the silence between us did not feel like punishment. It felt like mourning. There's a difference. Punishment keeps score. Mourning tells the truth. When Samuel finally woke, I was not in the room. Leah was. She came into the hallway crying and laughing at the same time. "He asked for water," she said, as if that were the most miraculous sentence she had ever spoken. Maybe it was. We did not tell him everything immediately. How could we? A body heals on its own schedule. So does the mind. He knew only that there had been a records issue, that a possible biological connection had surfaced, that we were waiting for confirmations no one had ever expected to need. When he finally looked at me properly, fully awake, his expression was polite. Tired. Curious. Not emotional. How could it be? I was a stranger with trembling hands and a face his own face might echo in certain lights. "Hello?" he said. His voice was rough. I said, "Hello, Samuel." And then I forgot every prepared sentence. He looked at me for a long second, then at Daniel, then at Leah. The room held its breath. I don't know what he saw. Shock, resemblance, fear. Maybe only a group of exhausted people standing too carefully around his bed. We think, I began, then stopped. He gave a faint, crooked smile despite the pain. That bad, huh? Leah laughed through tears. I did too. Because sometimes the body chooses laughter when grief becomes too large to hold in one shape. The full truth came in pieces after that. DNA confirmation. Archived paperwork. A retired administrator, located through impossible effort. A chain of mistakes that sounded too absurd to belong to real life, and yet did. Samuel listened, silent at first, then angry, then withdrawn, then asking practical questions no one was ready for. So you didn't know? No. And you? He looked at Daniel. You thought I was gone? Daniel nodded once. Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked back at me. And you don't remember? I swallowed. Not enough. He closed his eyes for a long time. I understood that. If I had been him, I might have hated us all. Maybe he did for a while. Maybe part of him still does. That would be fair. There are no clean emotional payoffs in stories like this. No moment where a son reaches instantly for a mother he never knew, and everything holy swells in the background. Life is more embarrassed than that. More wounded. More practical. We learned each other gradually. As adults. Which is another kind of sorrow. I learned that when he is uncomfortable, he scratches lightly at his left eyebrow. I learned he takes his tea without sugar. I learned he apologizes too quickly when asking for help. I learned he inherited my habit of staring out windows when thinking. Or maybe that is coincidence. Maybe blood is less poetic than we want it to be. Still, when he smiled fully for the first time after the accident, something inside me recognized the shape of it before my mind did, and that nearly undid me. No apology erased the years. Not mine to Leah. Not Daniel's to me. Not mine to Samuel for absence I had never intended, and yet somehow still embodied. Not Daniel's to Samuel for a death he believed into being through paperwork and silence. There was too much damage for neat healing. But there was no pretending left. That, in its own bleak way, was a mercy. We had lived too long inside performance. The hospital stripped us all. Under fluorescent lights, grief makes everyone honest eventually. In the weeks that followed, as Noah recovered and Samuel began the slow work of walking again, I spent long hours sitting beside hospital windows or plastic bedside chairs, thinking about the lives people call mistakes. How quickly we use that word. Mistake. As if it describes an event, a moment, a single bad decision. As if mistakes stay where we leave them. They don't. Some mistakes become architecture. Some become marriages. Some become silence. Some become children. I used to think consequences arrived quickly. You lie. You get caught. You pay. Simple. Moral. Contained. But that is a childish understanding of how life works. Real consequences are patient. They move underground. They wait in records rooms. In old scars. In the way a husband flinches from touch. In the way a daughter learns love is fragile. In the face of a man wheeled past you under hospital lights, carrying your blood and your absence at the same time. One evening, close to sunset, I sat outside Samuel's room, listening to the machines and the distant murmur of nurses changing shifts. The window at the end of the hallway had turned gold. Daniel came and sat beside me. No newspaper, no shield, just him, older now than either of us expected to feel. For a while we said nothing. Then he said, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life. It was one of the most honest things I had ever heard him say. I thought about that before answering. Maybe we stop trying to edit it, I said. He looked at me. I continued. Maybe we stop pretending it can be made clean. He lowered his eyes. After a moment, he nodded. And that was all. No reconciliation speech. No dramatic forgiveness. Just two tired people finally standing in the wreckage without insisting it was still a house. I don't know what Daniel and I are now. There are names people would want. Husband and wife. Strangers. Co-parents. Co-conspirators in a silence that ruined us. Maybe we are all of those things. Maybe none. What I know is this. When Samuel was discharged, he looked at me in the parking lot and said, awkwardly, I'll call you. Not Mama. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Just I'll call you. And somehow that felt more real than any dramatic claim could have. Because truth, when it finally arrives, rarely comes wrapped in perfect language. It comes limping, bandaged, late, but alive. Leah hugged both of us before getting into the car with Noah. Her hold on me lasted longer than it had in years, not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't, but because pain had finally stopped hiding behind manners. And once that happens, people can sometimes begin again from the rubble. Sometimes. Not always. Sometimes. As for me, I think often about that younger version of myself, the one before the wedding, the one at the party, the one who woke with gaps in her memory and chose silence because silence seemed survivable. I want to go back and hold her face in my hands and tell her that unnamed things do not disappear, that shame is not safety, that confusion deserves investigation, that your body keeps score even when your mind looks away. I think about the woman years later in the library, glowing under the attention of a younger man, because she had starved so long she mistook warmth for rescue. I want to tell her too. Being seen is not the same as being held, and wanting to feel alive can make you careless with the lives already braided into yours. Mostly, though, I think about the hallway. That moment. The nurse. The gurney. The cold light turning everyone the same color. And that question. Are you his mother? I still hear it sometimes when I wake in the night. Not as accusation. Not as miracle. As truth arriving on its own schedule. Unwelcome. Undeniable. Alive. Some mistakes don't end when you make them. They wait. They grow roots in the dark. They become part of the earth you walk on without knowing. And one day, when you least expect it, when you think the story is long finished, they come back. Not as punishment, not as forgiveness, as a life. A real, breathing, bleeding life that you have no choice but to face. And maybe, just maybe, that is not the worst thing in the world. Maybe the worst thing was the silence. Maybe the worst thing was the years we spent performing survival instead of living through the damage. Maybe the worst thing wasn't the mistake at all. It was believing we could bury it deep enough that it would never find its way home. Because it did. It always does. And now, for the first time in 33 years, I'm standing in the ruins of everything I thought I knew, without pretending they are still a house. And that is where this story begins. Not ends. Begins.